He was my best friend for over 2 decades. I let him into my home, my life, and even trusted him with my daughter. Then she told me they'd been talking behind my back. She was barely 18. He was pushing 40. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I made him watch as I quietly tore his world apart, piece by pathetic piece. My name's Mark, I'm 38, and for most of my adult life, I thought I knew what loyalty looked like. I had a best friend named Jake, and I treated him like family. Hell, I even let him call my daughter his niece. Turns out, behind my back, he was more interested in being her boyfriend. Jake and I had been best friends since college. We survived crappy jobs, breakups, weddings, divorces, and one very ill-advised investment in a taco truck. He was there when my daughter Lena was born. He held her in the hospital, called her his little sunshine, and showed up to every birthday with something loud, obnoxious, and impossible to return. He was the guy I trusted to crash on my couch after his own divorce. The guy who knew where the spare key was. The guy who had the damn garage code. When my marriage fell apart 5 years ago, Jake was the one who pulled me out of it. He got me to eat again, drink a little less, and pretend to sleep at night. That kind of history doesn't come easy. So when Lena turned 18, I didn't think twice about her texting him sometimes or calling him for help with college stuff. She liked him. He was fun. He always brought snacks. I never thought twice about it. Because what kind of man would I be if I didn't trust my best friend? Then came the conversation I can't forget. Lena sat me down one evening, visibly nervous. At first I thought she'd crashed the car, or failed a class, or was pregnant. Honestly, I would have preferred any of those. She started with, "Dad, promise you won't freak out." Which, obviously, meant I was about to freak out. She told me Jake had been talking to her differently lately, that he complimented her a lot, told her how mature she was, how grown up she looked. He'd messaged her late at night, said stuff like, "You're not a kid anymore," and "I wish I'd met you at a different time." I didn't say anything. Not one word. I felt something cold settle in my chest. It was like a switch flipped, and instead of exploding, my brain just went dead calm. My heart was breaking, sure, but something nastier had taken over. I thanked her for telling me. I told her she did the right thing. Then I asked for screenshots. She had them. Lots of them. They weren't technically illegal. She was 18, and he was careful with wording, but they were enough to tell me who he really was. He wasn't just some desperate divorce guy being stupid. He waited for the clock to run out, then made his move like some coward circling a finish line. I sat on that information for 2 days. Didn't talk to Jake. Didn't look at Lena. I just worked. I cleaned the garage. I exercised. And I thought. A lot. I realized that if I confronted him right away, he'd deny everything. Say it was a misunderstanding. That Lena misread him. Maybe even try to flip the narrative and say she came on to him. Because guys like him, they always think they're the victim. So I didn't give him that chance. Instead, I made a list. Literally opened a Google Doc and titled it, "How to Gut Jake's Life Without Going to Jail." Top of the list? Kill the friendship. Quietly, I stopped answering his texts, ignored his memes, didn't invite him over. When he asked if everything was okay, I told him I was just busy. He bought it. Guys like Jake always think people revolve around them, so it never occurred to him that I might be pulling away on purpose. Step 2. Start checking our shared connections. Jake and I didn't just hang out, we did business together. Small stuff, but enough to matter. We had a mutual friend named Paul who ran a contracting company. Jake picked up side gigs through him all the time. So I called Paul, said I wanted to catch up, and casually mentioned that Jake had been crossing some boundaries with my daughter. I didn't have to beg. Paul had 2 daughters himself. He was furious. "That's some predator-level bullshit," he said. I agreed. Then I let him sit with that information. 10 days later, Jake stopped getting contracts. Next up, Jake's ex-wife. I'd never really gotten involved in their mess. She and Jake hated each other too much for anyone to play peacemaker, but I reached out, told her what happened, sent her screenshots. She was horrified, but not surprised. Said he always had a thing for younger women. Said it was only a matter of time. I told her she might want to talk to their son, Derek. He was 16, lived with her most of the time, but idolized his dad. She agreed, and from what I heard, that conversation didn't go well for Jake. But the worst part? I didn't feel guilty, not even a little, because every move I made felt earned. This wasn't a mistake he made after too many beers. This was a man who waited until my daughter became legal, then slid into her messages like it was some rom-com instead of the worst betrayal I've ever experienced. And he thought he was getting away with it. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. But I wanted to enjoy the slow unraveling. Watch the shock crawl across his face as things started to slip, one by one. Next step? His job. And yeah, I had a plan for that too. After Lena dropped the bomb, I didn't lose my shit. That's what people expect, right? Yelling, throwing things, making a scene. Nope. I kept my mouth shut and played it cool. Inside, I was a storm, but outside, I looked like I was sipping tea in a library. That was the first move. Don't give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I had to be smarter. If I screamed and confronted Jake immediately, he'd spin it. He'd say it was a misunderstanding or that Lena was confused. You know how these assholes work. Always the victim, never the perpetrator. So I waited. Collected evidence quietly, methodically. I scrolled through those messages Lena showed me, reading every carefully crafted line. Jake knew exactly what he was doing. He was patient, calculating, thinking he was smooth enough to avoid consequences. I wasn't about to let that slide. First, I dug into Jake's recent history, checked his social media for clues, found old texts he'd accidentally left on his phone when he left it unlocked at my place. Small stuff, like jokes about how young girls these days were too much to handle, or complaining about his ex-wife's nagging. Nothing concrete enough to blackmail, but enough to paint a picture. Next, I tapped into mutual friends. Not to gossip, at least, not yet, but to see if anyone else noticed weird behavior. I found out he'd been bragging about Lena's maturity to some of his buddies. Not subtle at all. Most of them just laughed it off, but a couple got uneasy when I mentioned it in passing. Then, I started planting seeds. At a barbecue, I casually brought up the importance of respecting boundaries with younger people, watching how Jake shifted uncomfortably. I told Paul, our business partner, I was worried about Jake getting distracted with personal issues. It sounded innocent, but Paul caught the hint. While I was playing chess, Jake was still acting like he had control. He messaged me once, trying to joke about how nothing's changed between us. I didn't reply. That silence was a statement. He noticed. It pissed him off, but I didn't care. Silence can be louder than any insult. I also talked to Lena's mom, Rachel. She was shocked, but after hearing everything, she was ready to help. We agreed to keep Lena away from Jake, to protect her without turning this into a war zone. The last thing I wanted was to make my daughter feel like she was caught in some goddamn battlefield. In the meantime, I kept my job and business contacts on alert. I let people know, subtly, that Jake wasn't the guy they thought he was. It wasn't about ruining him just for the hell of it. It was about making sure no one else got hurt like we did. The best part? Jake didn't see any of this coming. He was too busy trying to act normal, hanging out with our group, acting like nothing was wrong. That arrogance was his weakness. Every time I saw him, I kept my tone neutral, but my mind was working. How do you break a man who thinks he's untouchable? How do you make him realize that the people who trusted him most now think he's a liar? This was only the beginning. Jake always liked to think he was untouchable, the kind of guy who could charm his way out of anything and come out smelling like a rose. Unfortunately for him, the real world doesn't work that way when you cross a line like he did. I knew his job was one of his last strongholds. He wasn't exactly a top performer, but he had Paul, our mutual business partner, pulling strings behind the scenes. So the plan was simple: cut off the oxygen. Let him drown in the consequences of his own bullshit. I called Paul, framed it like I was worried for Jake, dropped hints about distractions that could compromise their business. Paul didn't need much convincing. He's a straight shooter, a guy who values trust over loyalty. He told me to give him a few days to look into things. I had no doubt he'd act. And he did. Contracts Jake relied on disappeared. Not with fanfare or accusation, just quietly evaporated. The side gigs he picked up through Paul's company got handed to someone else. At first, Jake shrugged it off, probably thought it was a coincidence or bad luck. But it wasn't. Meanwhile, I reached out to Nina, the HR manager at Jake's company. I wasn't looking for dirt, but I was damn sure she'd want to know about potential risks, especially when they involve personal misconduct. I gave her the facts, no drama, no threats, just the truth and screenshots to back it up. Nina's a no-nonsense type. Within a week, I noticed a change in Jake's demeanor. He looked jittery, distracted. Meetings he was supposed to lead got postponed. Emails he usually sent first thing in the morning didn't come at all. Rumors started swirling, small stuff at first, whispers in the break room about professionalism and boundaries. Jake's charm wasn't working anymore. The same people who once laughed off his jokes were now avoiding him. It was like watching a man slowly realize the ground beneath him was shifting and cracking. I kept my distance but stayed informed. I wasn't there to make a scene. Those days were over. This was about smart moves and quiet ruin. At one point, Jake tried to call me out in front of a few mutual friends, throwing a half-assed joke about how nothing's changed between us. I smiled, said nothing, and walked away. Let the silence hit harder than any insult. Lena was also handling her part. She blocked Jake on every platform, changed her phone number, and avoided any social events he might attend. It wasn't easy, but she understood what was at stake. Rachel, my ex-wife, took the news hard but supported our decision to protect Lena. She also reached out to Derek, Jake's son, who had no idea about his father's behavior. The boy was angry and confused, and I don't blame him. I heard he confronted Jake, and things got ugly behind closed doors. All this quiet chaos was like watching a slow-motion car crash. Jake's world was crumbling piece by piece, and he was too proud to admit it. At work, his projects were slipping through his fingers. Socially, he was isolated. At home, his own son was turning away, and none of it was by accident. It was deliberate, calculated, because Jake thought he could cross my family and walk away without a scratch. He thought loyalty was a joke. He was wrong. Jake's world was starting to crumble, and it was getting uglier behind the scenes than anyone outside could see. He always looked composed when we ran into each other, like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. I could see it in his eyes, this mixture of frustration and disbelief. He thought he was untouchable, but the cracks were spreading fast, especially at home. I decided it was time to make sure the people closest to him knew the truth, starting with Rachel, his ex-wife. She wasn't exactly on friendly terms with Jake. Divorces tend to do that, but I knew she cared about their son, Derek. So I told her everything. Not sugar-coated, no drama, just facts. I sent her the screenshots, explained the situation, and warned her about what was happening with Lena. Rachel was furious, but supportive. She promised to talk to Derek and make sure he knew what was going on. I wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. Derek was a teenager, loyal to his dad in his own way, but he wasn't blind. Sure enough, a week later, Rachel told me Derek confronted Jake. The conversation didn't go well. Derek was angry, hurt, and confused. He called his dad out on the lies and the betrayal. Jake tried to twist the story, but his son wasn't buying it. That family dynamic shattered something inside Jake's carefully maintained facade. At the same time, I was handling things with Lena. She was stronger than I expected, but I could tell it weighed on her. Cutting off someone she once trusted wasn't easy. But she did it. No contact, no excuses, no drama. Just a clean break. While Jake was losing grip on his family, I made sure the right people heard about his behavior in the community. I wasn't out to ruin his life for fun. I wanted to protect others. I spoke to a few mutual friends and neighbors, subtly mentioning Jake's actions without outright accusations. People began to look at him differently. The whispers turned into questions. The questions into distance. Jake tried to fight back in his own way. He reached out to some of our old friends, trying to explain, deny, or charm his way back into their good graces. But it was too late. The damage was done. His credibility was shot. He was a liar in their eyes now. Even Derek's loyalty started to crack. The kid stopped spending weekends at his dad's and spent more time with Rachel. That hit Jake harder than losing a contract or a friendship. It was fascinating. In a way, watching a man like Jake struggle to keep a hold on a life he'd been destroying with his own hands. He was losing his job, his friends, his family, and all because he thought he could get away with betraying the one person who trusted him the most. And I never said a word to him. I let the silence speak. Jake's world wasn't just falling apart behind closed doors. It was starting to collapse in public, too. Word spreads fast when people sense something's off, and Jake had a lot of loose ends that were about to catch fire. One of those loose ends was Mrs. Henderson, the nosy neighbor who seemed to have a direct line to everyone's business in the neighborhood. She'd always been harmlessly annoying, but after I quietly tipped her off about Jake's behavior, her harmless nagging turned into targeted gossip. She didn't know everything, but enough to spread doubts, and that was all it took. At the next community meeting, something Jake usually dominated with fake charm and loud opinions. He found himself on the defensive. People started avoiding eye contact, whispering in corners, and outright questioning his integrity. It wasn't a public shaming spectacle, but the cold shoulders and hushed tones were worse. Jake's friends suddenly acted like strangers. Meanwhile, Derek, Jake's son, had finally had enough. The kid packed his bags and moved in full-time with his mom. No calls, no visits, just silence. That was the ultimate betrayal for Jake. The one person who should have stood by him walked away. At home, Lena had cut all ties completely. Blocked, deleted, vanished. No awkward run-ins, no forced conversations. Just a clean break that left Jake in the dust. Jake tried to fight back, sending vague texts to mutual friends, trying to explain or spin the story. Nobody was interested. The truth had already settled like a stain that wouldn't come out. People saw him for what he was, a liar who betrayed the people who trusted him most. And yet, Jake still clung to whatever scraps of control he had left. He kept showing up at the wrong places, trying to pretend like nothing happened. But the look on his face said it all. He was scared, confused, and, worst of all, alone. I never said a word to him during all this. No confrontation, no threats. Just quiet observation as his carefully built life unraveled piece by piece. Watching him scramble, watching him lose everything, was a strange kind of satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed his misery, but because this was the justice he deserved. He thought betrayal came without consequences. He was wrong. By this point, Jake's life was a mess no amount of charm could fix. He was walking around like a ghost in his own skin, wondering how everything fell apart so fast. It wasn't just the job loss or the community turning their backs. It was the silence, the absence of anyone left who actually believed in him. He lost contracts, sure. His phone barely rang. But worse than that, his friends stopped inviting him out. Invitations he used to take for granted stopped showing up. Even his kid, Derek, was gone, living with Rachel and refusing to pick up calls. I kept my distance, but I wanted to see how far this fall would go. There was no point gloating or rubbing it in. The damage was its own punishment. One afternoon, I ran into Jake at a coffee shop, unplanned. He looked worn down, like a man who's been awake too many nights wondering where it all went wrong. I said, "Hey." He barely nodded. No excuses, no lies, no fake smiles. That was it. The confrontation I never needed to give. He knew. Over the following weeks, Jake's reputation collapsed further. Former colleagues openly talked about his issues. Business partners distanced themselves. The people who once laughed at his jokes now whispered behind his back. I never reached out again. There was nothing left to say. Watching Jake unravel wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. The man who betrayed my family learned the hard way that some lines don't get crossed without consequences. He lost his job, his family, his friends, everything he cared about. And the whole time, he knew exactly who was behind it. Justice wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, slow, and damn effective.